You get 1 point by winning going first, 2 points by winning going second. Today I'm facing the 8th ladder opponent UnderTheGun, playing in the round 6 of the 2022 Summer 1v1 tournament. Only 8 people make to the finals, meaning that unless we draw, one of us will be out of the tourney, so I really have to either win or draw this. My opponent ended up predicting my army and by crushing it got the attacker's advantage of 7 troops. I've just captured Australia and hope that the zombies will capture a bunch of territories. They didn't waste their troops in the first turn, so I knew that could be likely. And that worked out because they brought my opponent below 12 territories and he only received 3 troops. But he invaded me with 4 versus 2 blitz rule. Quickly he took over Australia himself, and I couldn't invade it. So I just decided to try hiding from my opponent. But soon enough he came for me and crushed both of my armies. He gets 1 point. In the second game my opponent split his troops into 2 equal-size armies and one of them ended up being infected by zombies. And restarts only apply when the zombies infect the biggest army of one of the opponents, and since both of my opponent's armies were exactly equal, the restart according to the rules didn't apply, so that was really fortunate for me. But I didn't face such situation in my practice games, so I didn't really know what I should do. I ended up capturing some territories and crushing my opponent's other army, but that was mistake as with zombies additionally receiving lots of troops, they ended up crushing my army and ruining the big advantage I had. But at least I was left with Africa. My opponent didn't know whether zombies invaded it or not. After almost a whole turn of thinking to make his decision between invading it or not, at the end he decided to go with the hiding strategy, so I ended up receiving extra troops for holding Africa, and then I started properly guarding it. I held it for one more turn until my opponent traded in a set at 3 cards and invaded it. Luckily I've got a set at 3 cards as well, and since I knew his hiding spots, I just decided to immediately go for him. But unfortunately I lost the 8 versus 5 blitz rule. But the zombies finished the work for me anyway and I've got 2 points. In the third game I didn't predict my opponent's army, so I just decided to go for Australia without unleashing my opponent's biggest army towards it. Luckily for me the manual rules in a 7 versus 6 attack didn't go well for my opponent. And I ended up holding Australia. But then in the next turn my opponent decided to fortify his biggest army next to it. After one more he ended up invading it, and crushing my biggest army with getting the attacker's advantage of 3 troops. And then I just decided to capture and properly guard South America, as well as trying to keep some good hiding spots in the top by strengthening them in case that plan wouldn't work out for me. But to my surprise my opponent had the whole Asia captured and in his turn even received 12 troops. And with that broke through South America. After trading in a set I invaded him into Asia and he hasn't held it anymore. My opponent then after a few turns completely wiped me out from the bottom, but I was still left with 2 hiding armies in the top. Looking to the cards I knew that my opponent was hiding in Congo, but I didn't have a set at 4 and couldn't crush it. But in the same turn I accidentally discovered one of his armies in the top and got good manual rolls to crush it. But my opponent had a set at 4 cards and found my European army. The zombies finished wiping me out from North America, and with that my opponent received 2 points. In the fourth game with the zombies attacking in first turn and wasting troops, I went to capture as many territories as possible and capturing some continents. And my opponent broke through all of them except Africa. Getting to Australia he lost the same amount of troops on my 7 troops army, and then he ran out of time to make 2 versus 1 manual roll. Besides Africa I ended up with even 21 territories. And the first thing I decided to do is to wipe out the zombies, as I knew they were the only one thing which could lead of my opponent making a comeback. So to sustain my big advantage I had to wipe them out completely. And then in the third turn I wiped out my opponent completely as well and scored 8 points. Moving on to Castle Capital Conquest, we selected these territories as our capital spots. And after me capturing those territories my opponent tried to manual roll my biggest army, but unfortunately to him losing troops on it. and then he went to capture and properly guard his continent. But luckily I still invaded. And then I captured those 2 continents intending to properly guard them. My opponent broke through the bigger one, but I still ended up holding the smaller one. Then, since I wanted to play it safe, after recapturing it, I didn't leave troops on it, so I would rather strengthen my capital. And because of that my opponent invaded me again. But in the next turn I properly guarded both of the continents. Though my opponent got lucky to trade in a set at 3 cards and broke through both of them. I didn't have a set at 4 cards, so I couldn't recapture them when I needed to break through my opponent's continent. But then after trading in a set at 5 cards I recaptured both of them, and my opponent failed to break through both of them. I received even 15 troops in my turn, plus I traded in 8 troops from my set, and with that I've got 100% blitz roll to blitz my opponent's capital and score a point. In the 6th game we selected these territories as our capital spots. And I decided to capture those continents. Though it was a mistake for me to fortify my secondary army on the non-capital border, as by doing that I just let my opponent get the attacker's advantage, which this time was even of 5 troops. Then recapturing my continent and going to invade my opponent into his one as well, I should have selected the shorter path to do it while being in the troops' disadvantage, as at the end I just ended up with 3 troops to guard my capital. My opponent immediately blitzed it, and while I recaptured it, I couldn't do anything to break through both of my opponent's continents as well, so that was the game. With my such misplay my opponent easily scored 2 points. In the 7th game we decided to select these territories as our capital spots. And my opponent gave me an opportunity to blitz his secondary army similarly like I let him in the last game. But differently than him I lost the same number of troops without being favored by the attacker's advantage. And then also lost 3 versus 1 blitz roll. But at least I brought my opponent below 12 territories. And my opponent in his turn did the same, so to not let me get an extra troop. And I did the same thing in my next turn as well, though that was a bit risky for me to capture that 2 troops territory. But I've gone with it because I wanted to force my opponent split his troops with me recapturing my continent. My opponent then brought me to 11 territories again. I obviously saw that I couldn't keep up with my opponent in this territories race, and especially when he was supposed to trade in a set first, so I knew that I have to go with a 51% chance blitz roll, and this is what I did. The flip coin went for me and I scored 2 points. This is how our setup looked in the 8th game, and while my original plan was to go for this capital spot, I decided to change it to this one as I saw that I could trap a huge army of my opponent's troops with them really becoming stuck and making my opponent kinda handicapped. So from a very promising blizzard setup my opponent went to not so promising situation. I went to capture as many territories as possible in the left side. And then wanting to capture these territories behind my capital as well, I made a 5-troop split, but unfortunately I ran out of time. And with my opponent blitzing that army and only losing 1 troop, it improved my opponent's odds to make a comeback, as it was forcing me to pay more attention towards guarding my capital. My opponent traded in a set at 3 cards, but luckily he didn't go for my capital, which switching to manual rolls for true random odds would have been about 37% chance. I didn't have a set at 3 cards, but my opponent was only receiving 1 troop more than me, which wasn't too much of a big deal. At 4 cards I traded it in, and with capturing all these 3 continents I didn't unleash my opponent's biggest army towards them breaking through another border. And my opponent failed to break through 2 of them. So then, by obviously being in a very good advantage, I highly strengthened my capital, as I knew that it would be my opponent's last chance to try making a comeback. To making sure hold multiple continents would have been great, but not as great as strengthening my capital to minimize my opponent's chances of making a comeback, even if it meant that the game would last much longer. Luckily my opponent wasted a lot of troops here doing those manual rolls, which finally led me to be more focused on the other side continents. My opponent, despite trading in a set, failed to break through 2 of them after getting a bad blitz roll. and then it was just the time for me to guarantee a 100% blitz roll without unnecessary risking, or just making my opponent trap for 3 turns without him being able to receive a single card, and winning this match by this tourney rule. And I was actually going for it. But my opponent got fed up with it and just fortified his troops out of his capital, and with that I scored another 2 points, winning the series with 8-5 at the end. Here is the top 8 people who make it to the finals. And if you want to check out the full tournament series, then click on the playlist at the top right.